welcome to the Grognards of Gaming, and I am with you as always, Rob the Grognard Dog, and with me are my co-hosts,
Miracle Mike,
and
GMJD.
And we have a very special guest tonight. So with us is our good friend and longtime game master pal, Eddie D. So Eddie, welcome to Grognards of Gaming, and thanks for joining us for today's discussion, which is about running a flagship campaign. So we have invited Ed to be our interviewee because back in the day, we had, when we were playing Dungeons and Dragons, the game that we all cut our teeth on, Ed was our dungeon master for our flagship Dungeons and Dragons campaign, which went on for, God, how long was it, Ed? Like years, right? Was it a decade? Was it more than a decade?
It went on for a year. Well, thank you for inviting me first. So thanks for including me in on this. And yeah, it went for years. And not only did it go for years, like we wouldn't play for years at a time. And then all of a sudden we'd all be in town and everybody would get together and we just sort of figured out where we left off and kept on going.
Yeah, it's amazing how we did that. So before we even get to like the questions, why don't we talk about what we mean? This is usually how we start our episodes. What do we mean when we talk about a flagship campaign? So when I proposed this topic to add to our list of topics for Grognards, in my mind, the flagship game is like the big game that basically defines the gaming group. Or if it doesn't define the gaming group, it's the big game that the gaming group, that it's the go-to game for the gaming group, the thing that we mainly run. And you don't have to do it every time you get together. Sometimes you could do another game. You can even do like a whole campaign in another setting or system. But when that story arc or series of sessions is over, you return to the flagship game. It's the main game. So let me start with you, Mike. Do you have anything to add to that definition? When you think of a flagship game, what do you think of?
Now, and it's pretty much what you said. It's the main game you use, and today, a lot of the people that I talk to, they're in 5, 6, 7 different games. But you have that one game or that that one campaign where it's every week or every other week, and it's all the same people, and you all get them together. And I always tie it, and we've talked about this slightly before. It's usually tied to the Forever GM. It's the Forever GM that runs the flagship campaign. It's the one that is 90% of the time is the GM. But these things run, as both you and I were saying, these things run for years.
Yeah.
That they are just, it's usually homegrown. Usually the flagship campaign is homegrown. There are series of purchased modules that you can find that you could string together into but most of them are really homegrown. It's, when the Forever GM is building a world and everybody enjoys this world and comes in. Now, people may come and go, but there's usually like a core group of maybe 3 or 4 people that are always in the flagship game. It's the one, again, as Ed said, you cannot get together for a year and then, people move away and everybody comes back together, for a summer visit, and over a couple days, you jump right back into that campaign. You bring your characters back, these are from our perspective, and I actually, I wish I'd pulled it out, but from our perspective, this is one of those things where like you still have from our days, you still have your character sheets, somewhere in a folder from all of these games.
Right there.
So, so yeah, you have your character sheets from these games, and even when you retire the character, it's not just and I'll give you the current popular media example, which is Critical Role. Okay, they just finished up their 3rd campaign, but this is a world that they have played 3 sets of characters in. That's like their flagship game. they have all the side games, and we have our side games, but you have that one game where everybody just keeps playing in that world, and like your characters, age out or level out or power out or get killed and die, and you just keep playing in that same world and that same environment. So that's
Yeah.
where I see the flagship game being.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Very, very, very good. How about you, Jonathan? What do you think of when we talk about a flagship game?
Uh, I I think of mostly what you're talking about, but it's that one game that everybody becomes really excited about with the concept. It's that you can feel it when somebody suggests it, and everybody's like, "Oh," when the wheels start turning of what characters I can do and what's allowed, what's not allowed. And I'll come back to this later, but I think it's actually something that's harder to it's harder to pinpoint flagship games anymore because there's so much that you can do online, and people are part of one, two, three groups of people online that really uh, that that they're maybe a flagship game between two groups. I mean, it is a little harder to find now, but I think it's that one game that just sparks everybody's imagination, and everybody's all in. Everybody's in, and I think the only time that it comes when you don't have what we used to call a quorum, um, when you don't have enough people for the game,
Yeah.
and everybody decides let's just do like a one shot on the side. But you're right, they
Right.
always come back to that one game because everybody wants to get back to the story, and
Yeah.
they're invested in it. So
I love that. That's a great addition to the definition, the whole emotional investment in the campaign. All right, so Ed, as our original, or at least Mike and I, as our original flagship campaign GM, what are we missing from this definition, if anything? Is there anything you'd like to add to that, or do
It's
we have it?
it's the characters. The flagship game is the characters that the group are most invested in. It's
Yeah,
your characters that you want to see level the most, that you want to find the magic weapons or get the cool background story or eh, I'll give an example. I'm remembering an example of one time where we were playing D&D and all of your characters got killed. I think there was a vampire, and I think you were in her lair, and everything went bad, and all the rolls went bad, and everybody was killed in the adventure, except for one person got away. And that one person, I think it was your character, Rob, got away, went to the nearby town, hired a bunch of retainers, and the rest of the players played the retainers. You guys got captured by a bunch of slavers. You escaped the slavers. You found a bunch of resurrection scrolls or whatever. You went back to your original characters, resurrected the characters, and then continued to play the game as those characters. And so that was the flagship game where you guys went on a side quest just to get the flagship characters going again so you could continue the game.
right. Just to get back on course, get the flagship back on course. That's fantastic. Yeah, yeah. So that's great. So I think basically all of those things together, that's a great definition of the flagship game. So Ed, like, I guess we started your Dungeons and Dragons game, or at least I and Paul and Mike, we came in to your pre-existing Dungeons and Dragons group, which included your brother Jeff, and then Jimmy Tobin and Kenny, and then the rest of us from our neighborhood. We kind of joined, I guess, around the late 1980s, and then we were playing that through the 1990s. Even when I went off to New York City, whenever I would come back home, if I could meet with you guys, we would play. And so it was an AD&D game, right? We were playing. I guess it originally was AD&D First Edition, and then when Second Edition came out, I'm pretty sure with the proficiencies and all that stuff, we converted our characters to Second Edition. I think by the time Wizards of the Coast acquired Dungeons and Dragons, it came out with Third Edition. The campaign was pretty much over by that time. But we did First and Second Edition, and Mike said that usually flagship games are homegrown, but that they can incorporate pre-produced modules. And so that is exactly your campaign. So your campaign, we were like the heroes of Romaldia, and Romaldia, of course, is like the town that we were headquartered in, and that's based on your real life surname. And but while the town that we were headquartered in was your own creation, and the world around it was your own creation, we did incorporate Ravenloft. We did
Mhm.
incorporate the Slavers of Sajkanth,
Mhm.
which may or may not have been the
That's the
story arc
story
you were
I just
talking about.
told. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the story arc where my
A
character
real
got
mashup.
surrender.
It was a real mashup
It was a little bit of a
campaign.
mashup. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a campaign. What other pre-produced modules did you incorporate into the Romaldia campaign? Were there any others, or was it just those two?
There were lots of modules, and it's hard to remember the names of all the modules, so you'll have to excuse me on that one. But it wasn't the Heroes of Romaldia. We
Oh,
called the world Romaldia at one
yes.
point because
Yeah.
we were playing so much and we had done so many different things.
Yeah.
But you were the heroes of Somain, and
So Maine.
Somain was a town that was in one of the elemental evil modules, I think.
Temple of
And there was
Elemental Evil. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Temple of Elemental Evil, and there was a module leading up to it where there's this lady who rules the town of Somain, and there was a tower in the town, and so you guys ended up taking over the tower and becoming that was your base of operations, and so you guys became the heroes of Somain, and we didn't really play the module. I just used the setting that was in that module and the maps that were in that module. And I did that a lot. I would grab like a setting and some maps from whatever module I had, and that would become sort of the setting that you guys traveled through. And we didn't really play that module. You were just playing whatever game we had come up with,
Gotcha.
whatever
Gotcha.
story we had come up with at the time.
Okay. All right. So I'm basically going to ask you one question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Jonathan to interrogate you. But I guess my one burning question is, um, when you started this campaign, and I presume you started it with Jimmy and Kenny before the Paul and
Mhm.
Mike and I joined you.
Yep.
What 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 was your main um what was your main inspiration for the grand universe or the grand story or the meta plot that carried on all these years? Like, where did you get your inspiration from, uh since it was mostly homegrown?
Hard to say. I feel like the inspiration was, and I'm not saying this for any nostalgic reasons or sentimental things. I feel like the inspiration came from everybody in the group. It wasn't so much that I came up with like I was George Lucas and I came up with a story with Darth Vader and sort of a Sith background and things like that. I think it was more what you guys wanted to do, what you guys wanted to play, and if you remember, we kept bringing back things from previous games over and over again.
Yeah.
And so those were the things that you liked to see. Like we took a dead character, Ricky's dead character, Thasos, right? And
No,
he be,
Thasos was my guy.
oh, was he your guy? Okay,
Yeah,
so he was
Thasos.
he was your guy, and he dies at some point in just a random dungeon. He wasn't even the main character you were playing. You had other characters you were playing. He was just a
Correct.
side character. He dies, and then he comes back later as the big bad like three or
Yeah.
four times.
Yeah,
And
Face
and
Dark
so
Mace.
Dave's Dark Mace, right? And so I think the games weren't so much based upon like I would come up with this overall theme. I think it was whatever we all decided together that you guys wanted to do, and where would the story go as you guys made decisions.
Okay, so that's great. So for folks watching this who want tips on how to run a flagship game, that's, I guess, a great tip to start off with is, you come up with some ideas, but you're really trying to you're feeding off of the desires, the story ideas, the wants of the players, what they want to see happen, and you draw that in and you incorporate that. Okay, that's great. All right, so Mike, why don't I'll pass it to you, and then we can go to Jonathan. What would you like to ask?
Now, it was interesting, Ed, that you mentioned that we all played multiple sets of characters. and I don't remember how this came about, but that's the one thing I remember about your flagship game, because I still have one of my, I don't have both my characters, but I have one of them. I'm going to see if you remember this. I played a pair of characters that were a drow and a Duragar, and they had exchanged weapons because they were friends. So I played the Duragar with one set of people and the drow with another set of people in your campaign. Do you remember that?
I remember that you had the Drow and the Duragar, and
Okay.
I didn't remember. I didn't remember about the weapon switching, but I remember everybody always got a kick when you played because you always had like something that wasn't on the table to play. Like you came in one time and you're like, my guy knows pancration, this Greek
Yes.
That was the
Yes.
Roman
Duragar.
Yes.
That
That
was
was the
the
way of
Duragar.
Duragar.
Yes.
wrestling. That was a
Yes.
Duragar, right?
Yes.
And it was just a kick for everybody because you were in a bar fight using pancration and nobody had ever heard of it before.
And
Yes.
you had the Kender, Mike. I remember the Kender,
Oh,
the
the Kender.
Drow, and the Duragar.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
always
yeah.
had these quirky
Always had these
characters.
quirky characters. But the question is around the flagship game, because that's another thing, that we talk about, which now these days I conflate it with something they call West Marches, which is you have like 20 people playing a campaign, but you only have to get 5 or 6 of them together at a time. And that's what that flagship game reminded me of, because it was like, okay, if we have these 5 people, then we're playing this set of characters, and we have these 5 people, we're playing the other set of characters. And how did you balance that in your world with having like multiple parties going through in
I'll
the
say
world?
I'll say we had three things going maybe. So number one was what you were just saying. It depended on who showed up. So if we had about 10 people playing it, at one point we had 10 players playing the game.
Mhm.
And not there was no way all 10 players were going to show up every time, and we had to come up with creative ways where if we were playing the main game, why weren't all 10 people in the main game? And so a lot of the times we would have side stories and you guys would be going on side adventures maybe to get something that you was needed for the main adventure, right? And so you would use side characters, or maybe you would use your main characters and they would be going on a side quest. So number one is side quests, right? I think number two is we had more than one DM. It wasn't just me DMing. If you remember, it was also Steve DMing. And I would take ideas from what Steve did with the characters, and he would take ideas from what I did with the characters, and I would run the bigger, more epic things, and he would run these very small games where things happened and you guys progressed, and then we would roll that back into the epic games. Um, what else was there? And I remember that you guys liked to play more than one character. A lot of people like to play more than one character. I mean, Rob had the druid that went crazy at one point, and then he had the gnome who would make mechanical contraptions for everybody all the time. So and and Rob would never really play the gnome that much, right? He would just play it for like just enough to bring in a mechanical contraption that would throw the whole game off but make it go in an epic direction, right? And then that character was gone and he would be back to his main character again. So you guys had like supporting characters for your main characters? Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting that we didn't do. You and Steve didn't do a round robin GM model where you would run and then Steve would run and then you would run and then Steve would run, and we even did like a whole Grognards episode about the round robin GMing model. And Jonathan and I also have a separate podcast on the same YouTube channel where we talk about our Empire Club campaign that we ran in New York, where we did a round robin model where we would alternate each session who would GM. It wasn't that. It was more like the model proposed some years later by Ars Magica. Wizards of the Coast ultimately acquired Ars Magica. And it was Atlas Games. Wait, maybe it was Atlas Games, not Wizards of the Coast.
Wizard of the
Atlas,
Coast is like the Disney of
yeah,
RPG. They're
right. You're
acquiring
right.
everybody.
excuse me. It was Atlas Games who acquired Wizards of the Coast, or produced Wizards of the Coast. It was Atlas Games who produced Ars Magica, and the Ars Magica model there was an alpha GM, and then there was a beta GM. And the alpha GM ran most of the time and was really responsible for the campaign. And the beta GM was sort of like his Santa's helper. And that was more of the model that you did with Steve. And this was before Ars Magica, so you guys were doing it long before Ars Magica. And also another aspect of your flagship campaign that Ars Magica kind of modeled was the idea of multiple characters. So Ars Magica is basically a campaign setting, a fantasy campaign setting in mythic Europe, where all of the player characters play wizards who live in a covenant. But you also have companion characters. Everybody has one wizard and one companion. And so your companion can be anything else. You'd be like a fighter archetype or a cleric archetype or whatever you want it to be. And so we had our main characters, and then we had multiple companion characters, not just one, but multiple of them. And I think that is super helpful in a long-term campaign, because you can get a little burned out of playing one character all the time. And so to have these other characters to bounce back and forth from is super helpful. So anyone who's thinking of running a long-term flagship campaign, I highly recommend that you allow the players to play multiple characters, and they'll always come back to their main character. That's the character that they're most invested in, as Ed mentioned when I asked him to define a flagship campaign. Jonathan said it's the story that everybody gets invested in, but Ed found the nuance. It's also the characters. The players are very invested in the characters, and so they'll come back to the main characters. But I think it's good to have multiple characters. And another thing is, that's something, Jonathan, that we did in our New York flagship game, which was the 1930s pulp game. We had multiple characters. So we had our main characters, but every once in a while we'd play our other characters. And that just made it...
Some of us had more characters than others.
Some
had
of
more
us did.
multiple characters than others.
That is true. But I think that is key to running a long-term flagship campaign is the players have other personae to explore, so they don't get tired of things. All right, so Jonathan, no, go ahead. I'll popcorn it to you, pal. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to start off by asking a couple of questions, because I wasn't, of all the people on the screens, I wasn't really in that game. But how long, first of all, did that game go on for? I'd be interested in knowing. How many years?
It went for years. We were in high school, maybe junior, senior year of high school. Rob's a little bit older than us. Mike's a little bit older than my people back then that were playing the game. But it probably was like junior, senior year of high school that we all finally got together, the two neighborhoods. And we must have played till maybe we were 30 years old. Maybe a little bit more than that, but that could be a good 15 years like of solid gaming. But when we were younger, we were doing it every Sunday, every other Sunday. We were going, like when Steve was doing the side games, people would go to Steve's house in the middle of the week and play the side game. Mike would come in like once a month or so and splash the game and then disappear again for a little while. And we had other players like that who would just come in and mess things up a little bit and then just disappear for like a couple months.
To be fair, I was in Jersey at the time, so it was kind of hard to get over to Philly where you guys were.
Yeah. That's okay. Everybody loved it when you showed up and changed everything.
So you played the game for about 15 years, and it was mostly the one flagship game we're talking about, right? The fantasy game.
Everything
how many
into the flagship game. Everything fed in and came out of it. I think.
How many people were playing most of the time, and how many people were in the group? That's two different questions. I don't know if you.
It was always Rob. It was always Paul. It was always Steve. My brother Jeff. me, so five. There were five of us. That was the core group, and then Mike would show up every once in a while. Ken would show up every once in a while. Pat would show up every once in a long while. Would show up. Who
Jimmy
else?
Tobin.
Jimmy Tobin would show up every once in a while, and then Ricky would show up every once in a while, and then we'd have guest people. We just have people who were our friends from other walks of people who played baseball on the street were like, we're not doing anything today, it's raining, can we play with you? And they had no idea what they were doing, and but they would come in and play a character for a little bit and never show up again. So we had guest players who would show up every once in a while.
All right. So you played for a long time. That's a lot of players, which I think some people would find very daunting. And how, I don't know if there's any one way you've done this. And it sounds like what Rob's already said is true, is that you were willing to kind of go where the story took you, or even go to a different story depending on who was there, which is great. But did you ever have a point where you felt like pressure that you were the person, the go-to person? I mean, how did you handle having to, well, this Sunday I've got to come up with a game. I mean, it's maybe different back then when we were doing D&D, because there was an idea of just being able to come up with a dungeon. And nowadays there's much more of an emphasis on story arc. So that we have one GM that we play with a lot, Chris, who swears by story arc and doesn't like the monster of the week kind of game or the dungeon of the week kind of game where you just play a dungeon and then you go to the next one. He really wants there to be a big story arc and have a big ending at the end of the campaign. But what you did really doesn't sound like it had a it didn't have a goal at the end. I don't mean goal, but other than, you certainly were wanting people to have fun, but there wasn't like an end story
We
that you were going.
definitely had goals, but it wasn't. It was more the journey than the goal, right? And so, like, I remember, I think our first big, we had played in smaller groups leading up to this first big adventure, which was the werewolf adventure that was in the town of Somain. And these werewolves had tried to take over the town, and all the characters, the main characters that we were playing, had found their way into this temple where they had found some weapons that they can use against the werewolves. And I remember Rob's character was a halfling, and he found this sword called Eye Biter and a ring where he could turn into a raven. So he had a movement form, and he had a sword called Eye Biter. If you rolled a 20, it would cut your eye out. It would cut your eye out and eat your eye. And it the story was very wide open. Like, I put the setting there, and it was up to them to figure out what they were going to find and what they did. And Rob's character claimed Eye Biter, but anybody in the story could have claimed it and become that person in the story. And it just so happened at the end of the story, he made the killing blow with Eye Biter on the cleric who was running all of the werewolves, and he rolled a 20 and stabbed the guy in the eye and took his eye out. So very much like, I would put the scenario in front of them, and I would use pieces of different modules that we had to be able to support what we were doing. But it was up to them how the show went, like how the story went. And so who knew that would be the end of the story? That wasn't planned, but it was certainly a fun end of the story.
Right.
Does that sort of
Follow-up
answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, no, it does. But follow-up question: how in the world did you keep track of all the story threads? That sounds like a huge amount of story threads.
It was
I
definitely
mean,
Steve. It was definitely our friend Steve who kept track of all the story threads. He was a savant, he's a super genius, and he would write diaries of the stories after we played them. And so we had these diaries to go back to basically and look at. And I would read his stories. He would send me his stories when I was in college of what he DM'd. And that's where we got the Ring of Raylenex. Do you remember the Ring of Raylenex?
Yes, I
And
do.
he came up with this magical item that allowed the characters to teleport in one of his small games. I took that magic item from reading his stories over while I was in college, and when I came back for the summer, we used that ring to travel back in time to Ravenloft, where you guys became vampire hunters in the town of Ravenloft. And I don't even know if we even used Strahd. You guys were just fighting vampires so that you could get the ring back and get back to your own time. And I think you created some sort of bootstrap paradox in the course of doing that. So
Did somebody become their own grandfather?
I think something like no, we didn't do grandfather paradox, just the bootstrap paradox. Like they were helping their future selves
Grandfather, right?
beat the character in the future they were trying to beat,
Yeah.
and it eventually came back to that. And so yeah, the story. I forget what your question was. I was answering a question, but I forget what your question was.
How
But,
you remembered it all.
oh, how did
How
we
do you
remember all of it? I didn't remember all of it. I would just remember bits and pieces of what we did and just bring it back every now and then. And
Yeah.
so I didn't remember the whole story all the time. And I don't think you needed to remember the whole story all the time because everybody remembers their part of the story.
Yeah.
And so as long as you highlight one of the characters and they could bring in their part of the story for a little while, they'll bring in what they remember. It's too much work to try to remember everything and try to plot everything, or at least that's the way I saw it.
Now, one of the things,
Honey,
and
you're
you
so
and you say that
yeah.
because I remember this, and this is so there's running gags these days about like there's one note taker in every
Mhm.
every RPG session. Back in the day, we were all note takers. We were all writing our piece of the story and keeping it all together. And that's,
Right.
we could bring back and go, oh, I have, this is what I did last time. And this is, and everything like that. We were just, I don't know if it was the group, but most of us we were all writers at the time. So it was,
Did you ever did anybody here ever go back and find notes that you'd written about a game like that where you
Yeah.
didn't even realize you were writing that many notes and that detailed a background or that detailed I had somebody come up to me from a game from high school, from a traveler game we had, and handed me notes that he had like files full of all of our stuff and said, I found these and I think they're yours. And I don't even remember doing them, but they're all my handwriting and they're all my drawing style. And I was like, when did I have time to do it? It was just, it's amazing when you do go back and find how much detail you were able to put into stuff.
I,
And
I, I still have a bunch of
yeah,
copybooks. I still have a bunch of copybooks from the old days with all my notes leading up to like what I would try to plan for the adventures. So what scenarios they would have to go through and what monsters I would bring in and which book I would have to refer to do that. And then I also have all of Steve's notes still from when he would email me all of that stuff when email was very early. And even Rob used to send me Star Frontiers notes about where the campaign had gone and how my character related to the campaign, even though I wasn't even playing anymore. And
is it
and
the
so yeah, we used to read a lot.
and it's the spiral notebook that has the pizza stains and the coffee cup
Hmm.
stain on it and somebody spilled something on it, and you kind of remember it when you were looking at it, what happened. But yeah, no, that's great though. I mean, being
I,
able to go back and actually see some of that stuff and cross check what other people were
Before you ask me another question, I'll also throw one more thing in there. Being able to, I think what brought the group together a lot to be able to have like these big games like this is we had a lot of people who would draw pictures of what was going on. And I think it was the party pick created sort of this epic feel of this group being together. And my brother was really good at drawing. Ken was really good at drawing, and Rob was really good at creating comics. Rob, you weren't as good as Jeff and Ken was at drawing, but you were great at making like these full comics of what we were doing.
Yeah.
And so that helped. Like when we were sitting there, and by the end of an adventure, Jeffrey would put up a party pic of everybody in the party. That created sort of that epic moment that we're a group. This is us every time we play. So
Yeah.
visual writing, both of those things together.
Mike, it looked like you were going to say something.
No, you just reminded me because Rob, and I'll show it on one of these episodes. I don't have it at hand now, but you remember the copybook that I wrapped in brown paper and we drew pictures and put it all over. And I told you when I moved, I found it when I moved from New Jersey. I found it in a box and it still has some stories and stuff in it. I'll share it. I'll share it another time on the podcast. But yeah, I still have one of those. That's like the old copybook. Actually, I remember getting in trouble in 8th grade in grade school because some of the pictures they took for being satanic.
Yeah.
And you'll understand when I show you the book because it goes back to 8th grade Catholic school.
Yeah. That's funny.
So.
Yeah. So Ed, you said some things that I wanted to highlight. So you mentioned the magic items, that you presented to the players, and that helped define the player characters. So for my character, the halfling thief Raven, I acquired Eye Biter, the short sword that on a 20 would take out the eye of the opponent, and also the ring that would allow Raven to turn into a raven and fly. But there were also, like Steve's character had the magic forearm. I think he lost his arm. His arm was severed, and you provided him with a magic forearm. It was kind of like the gauntlet of Thanos in a way, right? From Marvel Comics, where
That's right,
each finger, each finger did something special. And all of the player characters, I think Paul's character had a magic longsword, Wolfsbane, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't remember what did your brother Jeff have? He had a magic item.
I think we gave him the ogre bracers, and I think we gave him. I think at one point he got the Maul of the Titans because it just seemed fun to give out the Maul of the Titans.
There you go. So I think that if you're going to run a flagship game, that really helps to give it some personalized flavor. If at some point, it doesn't have to be at the beginning, you can make the player characters earn it, but at some point, giving them each a special magic item that allows the player character to be not defined by it, but for it to become a part of their persona. Because when you think of the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon that used to air in the 1980s, that was how they did it. Like each character had their own magic item. The acrobat had the magic a bow staff that she would jump with, and the little barbarian kid had I think it was a magic hammer or something. So the cavalier character had the magic shield. So that helps, I think, and that was a really important part of my memory of the flagship campaign. And also, I think it was Mike said, we were all writers in those days. That's how you helped remember things. We were all writers. I think nowadays that's not necessarily the case. I think that the younger generation who may be playing, they're not. I think that writing is sort of a lost craft these days because of the electronic revolution. So how do you remember things now? Well, so I would say my advice to GMs who want to run flagship campaign is maybe don't rely on your players the way Ed was able to back in the 80s and 90s. He was able to rely on his beta GM, and he was able to rely on we the players. Nowadays, you might need as a GM to do a little bit of work. And, we had the Dungeon Minister on as a guest on Grognards of Gaming. And the Dungeon Minister is running a Beck Me Dungeons and Dragons campaign for his children. And, I mentioned in one of his recent videos in the comments, I always try to comment when I watch his videos. And I mentioned in the comments because he said in the video he had a hard time remembering what it had transpired, because he didn't make the video until significantly after the session was played. And in the comments, I put something like, well, what I always do, just because I'm losing brain cells by the year, I always write at the end of every session that I run, no matter what game I'm running, what genre I'm running. I always sit down when the game is over at a day or two after, because if you do it immediately after, you're going to have just too much information in your head. But you wait a day or two, and the extraneous stuff you forget, and the important stuff you still remember. If you wait any longer than 3 or 4 days, you're going to start forgetting important details. But about 2 or 3 days, a day or two after you run the session, I sit down and I write a 3-paragraph summary, no more and no less, a 3-paragraph summary of what I did that session, so that the next time I come to this game, and it may be a month from now, I could go back and read the 3-paragraph summary, and bam, that's the perfect amount. Now, the dungeon minister said in his counter comment, that sounds like work, and I understand that. Like, not everybody wants to write, and it's a lot of work to be a GM to begin with. So to put this additional onus on yourself, it could have a chilling effect on the desire to GM. You don't have to do that. I run a Vegas game. It's set in Las Vegas in the 1960s, and the player characters play criminals. And so the criminals are the protagonists. We're sort of like anti-heroes. It's sort of like a Sopranos kind of model. And it's set in Vegas in the 60s. And what I do is I have an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of paper, and it's got like a marble background on it to represent a marble bar. And superimposed on the marble background is a cocktail napkin. So I have a bunch of these blank sheets, blank cocktail napkins on a marble bar. And I have a stack of them in the folder. And whenever I finish a session, I whip out one of these things, and on the blank cocktail napkin, it's got like a little ring from a glass, glass of brandy or something. It's got a little stain on it. It's got a little logo for the bar. But right on the blank cocktail napkin with a pen, I grab it, and I just, whatever I can fit on the cocktail napkin, I handwrite in. And that's my notes for that session of the Vegas game. And it tends to be a lot less information than it would be for my 3-paragraph model, which I might use for Star Frontiers or Dungeons and Dragons, or the Dresden Childlings game, which I also have a show on this YouTube channel. But that's okay, because what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You know what I mean? So if you don't have a complete memory of what went on, that's okay. That's perfectly in keeping with the setting. The little squib that I could fit on the cocktail napkin is enough. So at the very least, as a GM running a flagship game, you might want to do something akin to the cocktail napkin model. If you are inclined to write a 3-paragraph summary, then do it. I don't recommend going more than 3 paragraphs, because then it's going to be too much for you to write. It's going to be too much for you to read later on. Nobody else is going to want to read it to the extent that you want to share it with your players. 3 paragraphs is just the right size. So those are some thoughts that came to mind. All right.
I will say, trying to remember the things that I did before by looking at cocktail napkins sounds very much like my 20s. So that's an effective way to remember things previously happened. And I will also say that I think we benefited from, and this is not an age thing, new versus old, but I think we benefited from being in the pre sort of computer age when we played D&D. We sat around a table. We had to have paper because that's all we had. And we had to have pencils, and so we had books of clean sheets of paper to write on. And so we were sitting there writing and doodling and taking notes of everything that we were doing. We couldn't go on the internet and look up magic weapons and stories and things. We only had the modules and the books that we had all collectively brought to the table with us. And there was no other reference for anything that we were doing. So it was a lot of making it up or just what you could reference in front of you, versus now when we play, we're all online like this. We may not be sitting at a desk. Who knows, if you even have any paper in front of you, or you taking notes on the computer. There's so many different ways to play and to look things up. Like, I don't have to draw a picture of anything. I can look up a picture and take a picture from online and say, oh, that's my character's flag, that he's flying above his ship. I don't have to be as creative as I used to be because there's so much stuff out there already. So maybe we benefited from the pre-computer age.
Yeah, I remember how big an advancement it was just to have a vinyl map that you could erase pen
Right.
markings on it, how big a deal that was. Because,
Mhm.
That was.
whoa, we were like,
We were. All right, so maybe one more go around before we wrap. Mike, is there anything else you'd like to address with Ed?
So it's not as much a question as it is an observation, and it's interesting. Because I always bring up like what current popular media is, and it's another aspect of the flagship game. Now, it's something that we did often, not just with the flagship game, but eventually, and Ed had mentioned it. This is, a lot of the role playing games devolved into a dungeon crawl for a little while, where it was like hack and slash, do whatever you do. Now you had mentioned, and Rob, you had mentioned before on one of the previous ones when we were talking about how the World of Darkness came along and changed things from dungeon crawl to dramatization and more role playing and less dice rolling and things of that nature. But here's the thing about a flagship campaign, which, and Eddie has mentioned this and he encouraged this, which was, people think about it now, and this is why I'm going to relate it to popular media. The flagship game became about character arcs. It became about, there were sessions we had, and I remember, and this is what, Ed used to say, I used to crash the game. But I would crash the game, and Ed would go off on my character tangent because I happened to be there for the week. And here's your character story this week. You're not going to be with us for another month, so we're going to develop your character and do your character arc. Now, if you watch a lot of the modern stuff, Critical Role, Dimension 20, other things like that, they are all about character arc. It is all about making characters beloved not just to the people at the table, but the people watching. And that's the kind of thing that we did really like with Ed's flagship game is we made like these beloved characters that we're still talking about now more than 20 years later. Okay. Yeah. I think, suggestion sometime maybe we should all get together and write a book about some of these adventures and these characters. And, we'll do a serial. Each person will do one nice little, just an
like
idea.
an anthology.
Like an anthology. Yes.
That's a great
we
idea.
had a guest who did it with their game, and plenty of people have done that with their games and
Yeah.
made other formats out of them: books, movies, television shows.
Yeah,
But-
what was that? What was that expanded universe Star Wars novel, Tales from the Cantina? We could do something like that, where we each from the perspective of our characters.
But I just wanted to give Ed credit because that's how he ran the campaign. It wasn't just about here's my plan. He sat down and saw where we were invested in the characters and took things in that direction. And we've talked about doing that as a GM before, but it is really, really crucial to keep the flagship game going. You got to give, everybody their arc and everybody their time. So one week may be about one character, and the next week you take another character and advance their arc. That's really one of the ways that Ed kept the flagship game going, and the way to keep a flagship game going.
Yeah. Jonathan?
We talked about one thing, but I don't think it actually applies here, maybe. So I'll just ask this. You said everything came out of the flagship game. You didn't have like what we had more in the 90s and the 2000s where we were playing a lot of other stuff like one shots of different types of games, but that didn't happen here, did it?
Well, we did. Like, we played Star Frontiers, and Rob ran a great campaign in Star Frontiers, and we had a lot of fun playing Star Frontiers. But that was definitely not the main game that we played all the time. And then we started doing World of Darkness, and so Steve started running World of Darkness, and we had a bunch of other DMs doing World of Darkness. We didn't didn't play it an awful lot. This Sunday game that we would play was really the one that we were fully invested in, and we played more D&D than anything else. So I guess so.
Yeah,
So
I would say it was
there
probably
ever
like.
any?
I'm sorry, Jonathan. I would say it was probably like 85% Ed's Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and maybe of that 85%, maybe like 40% or 35% was Steve as the beta GM. And then aside from the 85% D&D, like maybe I did like 10% of Star Frontiers, and then the remaining 5% were these other games. Like one time, I think we made up characters for Toon. I don't know that we ever actually played. Did we actually play a session of Toon?
We never played.
We never played, right? But we made up characters
Rob,
for it, and the World of Darkness. That would have been like the last 5%.
Rob, that's 145%.
Well, I went to grad school for what I went to grad school for because I couldn't do math.
There would be no math.
I was told there would be no math.
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
There was more content for D&D back then too, if you remember. So you were talking how we played first edition and second edition. We really settled on third edition. Now everybody didn't like that we settled on third edition, and we had a lot of people who would refuse to look in the third edition book because they only wanted to use the second edition book. Paul, but and Mike too. But when third edition came out, they made all those expansion character booklets for the different characters that you have, like the fighter booklet and the mage booklet and the cleric booklet, and you could do so many things, and there were so many more rules. So when we were playing when we played Star Frontiers, there was barely anything for Star Frontiers, and I think one of the things that we used was something that Rob had photocopied and handed out to everybody because you couldn't buy the book anymore.
That's right.
So the same for World of Darkness. Became very rich later on, but when it started, you just had the vampire book, and that's all you had. So I think D&D at that time was growing very big before it all crashed later on.
Well, that was great. So I hope that this information that we provided is both entertaining and informative to those who would like to run a flagship game. I know it can seem daunting, but I think we kind of ended as we began, which is Ed said that he largely built the story by feeding off of what the players wanted to see and what the players kind of fed him through their character concepts and through what they wanted for their characters. And I think that as long as you follow that trail, you follow that fallopian trail, and you'll always end up at the
Fallopian?
You'll always end up with a rich story.
The circle of life.
That's right, the circle of life. So, all of that said, Ed, I think this was really helpful talking to you. Paul, he tries to make it, and a lot of things get in the way. He's got a busy real life. So, we've got room for another panel member if you'd like to sort of make it a regular thing and join the Grognards regularly. Is that something you might like to do?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be part of the group. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, great. So one of us. Okay, so then I'll pose this question to the lot of you. So next time on Grognards of Gaming, we've got a lot of topics, floating around in our collective heads. What do you think, Jonathan? I think it might be your turn to pick a topic. What would you like to discuss next time on the Grognards of Gaming?
Mike, we were talking about something before. I can't think of what it was.
GM burnout.
GM burnout.
Oh,
which is this is what happens when your GM burns out.
Completely off the top of my head, I'm gonna say GM Burnout.
GM
I think
Burnout.
I actually, yeah, I think with
Okay, what do you guys think? Ed, Mike, what do you think about GM Burnout the next
Yeah,
time?
we could do that. Absolutely.
I've never had GM burnout, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'd like to get that perspective. That'd be awesome. All right. So very good. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to the Grognards of Gaming. Join us next time when the Grognard panel will be discussing GM Burnout. And until then, happy gaming, as Paul would say. So long, everybody. See you next time.